Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to transform this Hobby Lobby charcuterie board into something special for the holidays. I only paid $18.99 for this. Just kidding, I got it for half off. So I think it was like $9 or something. And I think it's perfect for what we want to do. I'm going to be creating like a V split where my epoxy is going to be cutting in on this board. So first we want to determine how far in I want that V split to go. And to do that, I'm going to create my own little template with a piece of notebook paper. First, I'm going to find the width of my board with the paper. I'm just going to fold the edge there against one edge of the cutting board, and that'll give me the width, and I'll trim off the excess. Then I'm going to fold my paper in half to find the true center, and that's also going to be the true center of the board. And then I will cut that piece of paper while it's folded at the angle that I want our epoxy to cut in at. I hope that all makes sense. Basically, it was a fancy way of creating a little V angle so I can get a nice straight V into our board. I'm going to put my masking tape lines right up against that template we just created. And now I'm ready to start prepping the wood. I've got some 80 grit sanding paper here, and I'm just going to sand all the areas that my epoxy is going to be touching, as well as where my tape needs to be adhering really well, like along the back side. You don't have to sand down too hard, just lightly enough to rough up the finish and take off that first layer of butcher block oil or whatever's on there to shine the finish. Next, we're just going to clean everything up with some rubbing alcohol and a paper towel and remove any extra debris. And don't worry if you've taken away some of the shine or anything from that wood. We're going to restore it later when we're finished. Now that we're all prepped, I'm going to tape off the back side of my board. Just using some thicker strips of painter's tape, I'm going to go from top to bottom, just ending kind of midway where I don't need a whole lot of tape because I'll cover the remainder of the board with some saran wrap. You want to make sure that you really press this tape down firmly. I like to use a vinyl squeegee to help me do that. Once I've completely covered the areas I need covered with the painter's tape, I'm going to go along the edges with my craft knife so that I can cut right up against where the epoxy will meet the sides of the board but not go too far down to where we might accidentally get it underneath the board. You can see here what my board will look like once it's fully prepped. It's really important that we don't skip this step to ensure that our epoxy will get a firm bond to the wood. Next, I want to make a little base coat of white so that if by chance there's some kind of not so good coverage from our epoxy, I don't want any of the wood shining through. You can totally skip this step if you don't want to include a base coat, if you want some of that wood shining through, or if you want to do different colors, it's completely up to you. Once I get a nice even coat on here, I'm going to let this dry until it's completely dry to the touch, which in this case was about a half hour before we moved on to the next step. For this project, I'm mixing 140 milliliters of Flynn Sisters Premium Epoxy Artist Cure resin. This is the perfect epoxy for this kind of project. It's got a great working time. I did heat up part A slightly before measuring and mixing, and that was just to help me see all the way through and get a really good mix to make sure we were ready to go. I divided up my epoxy into a few different medicine cups, and I'm using about 5 different colorants for this project today. I will have them all listed in the description box. In my biggest cup of epoxy, which is about 60 milliliters, I poured a couple drops of Alumilite's white epoxy dye. I love putting colorants into epoxy dyes because I feel like they suspend really beautifully. So we're going to mix all our colorants. I'm using a pearl, I'm using kind of a tan khaki mica, and I'm also using a really pretty gold, and of course some gold glitter. Once I've got all my colorants mixed up in their different little medicine cups, I'm going to pour down that white epoxy dye first. So we've mixed that with about somewhere between 30 and 60 milliliters here. and I'm going to pour that all over the cup and spread it out to a nice even coat, making sure I get the sides and the inside of my handle as well. Once I've got all that white epoxy spread out nicely, we're ready to start pouring in our colorants. The first one I'm going to drop here is this pearl. It's absolutely gorgeous. I got it from nmoshop.com. I forgot what it's called though, so I will have it listed in the description box. And that's really going to be the star of the show for this board. So I'm going to pour really generously in kind of funky stripes all the way throughout. After pouring the pearl, I wanted to spread it out a little bit, so I just sort of tilted my board back and forth to spread out those pearled sections. After pouring the pearl color, I went down with the khaki color. This khaki color is from Simply Sarah's Custom Creations. Again, I don't remember what it's called, sorry. But I did want to pour this one a little more conservatively just because it really ended up being dark. If you wanted to lighten this color up, it lightens up beautifully with just more white pearl. After pouring down that khaki color, I went in with my heat gun and started just blending and blooming the tan khaki color into the pearl. Being careful not to leave the heat gun on any one place for too long as to not scorch the epoxy. This is where you get to really be creative and decide where you want more movement, where you want to shift around a color, where on your piece might need some more saturation, or if you want to fan a line out more or less. But remember, you do have to kind of work quickly. You don't want to be blowing this around too much. Next, I went in with the glitter. This glitter is called Rain from myramakes.com, and I mixed that into one of the medicine cups of epoxy and just poured that in. After I poured it in some lines, I feathered the edges of those lines with a silicone brush tool just to make it look more organic in the piece. Finally, using the same brush tool that I've cleaned off, I'm going to traipse in some of that beautiful gold. This is Davis from nmoshop.com, and I'm really just veining it in throughout. It is really dark though, so I'm being very conservative. Instead of just pouring it in, I'm very lightly just painting it in instead, because I can always add more, I just can't take away. Next, I kind of went around with the remaining pots of colorants that I had and kind of added in some lighter colors or some darker colors depending on what I thought a certain section needed. I also went around the bottom and removed any kind of excess drips. Also made sure the sides were fully covered and not just bare. So we're going to set a timer on our watch, and I'm going to come back to this in about a half hour to remove my tape from the front of the board. So when you do this, be very careful because obviously your epoxy is still very wet. I'm going to take some extra time again to go around and remove any drips from the bottom. You can also run a popsicle stick along the bottom to get the drips that way. But bottom line is we need to keep as much of the epoxy away from that tape as possible. We've got the tape removed from the front. I'm going to let it dry for a few more hours before we remove the tape from the back. I did not take my own advice though, and I forgot to remove the tape last night. So it fully cured with the tape, and that's okay. It's just going to be a little trickier to get off. If this happens to you, no problem. Grab your heat gun with the little nozzle and use that to kind of loosen up and soften the resin from that tape, and you can easily score against it if you have to, or you can just end up pulling it up. Now, once you get it all removed, you're going to have to replace it because we have to put a clear coat layer over the colorant layer, but we don't want to do 2 layers of epoxy with the same tape because that's going to be double trouble for removing it. So we're going to replace the tape in the same way that we put it on the first time, and now we're ready for our decals and our final coat. After I get the transfer tape on my decal, I'm just going to place it face down on my desk so that I can peel back that transfer paper so I don't run into any drama when I go to apply the decal on the board. Using the overhang of transfer tape, I'm going to anchor the decal onto my board. I keep wanting to say tumbler, sorry. I'm going to anchor it onto my board and I'm going to measure twice, so I only have to cut once. We want to make sure this is nice and centered. I'm going to peel back half of the decal and cut back half of that transfer paper. Then firmly place the decal down. Then repeat the same process on the opposite side. This is called the hinge method. After I got the decal on there, I applied one of my new UV DTFs from our shop. We just added these this week. This is from one of the element sheets that we sell. We have a very small selection to start, but check it out. They're super fun to work with. You can apply them to almost any surface. And look at how beautifully it rounds out this project. After I got that on there, I had some leftover textured vinyl stripes that I also cut with my Cricut. These are just rectangles that I cut at 11.5 inches wide by 0.10 inches tall. And I just applied those to the bottom to frame that edge really beautifully and just trim the excess off with my craft knife. Now we're ready to apply the final coat of epoxy. I replaced all my tape, making sure to put that edge line just offset from the edge of that colorant layer so that our clear coat of epoxy goes just over it to seal everything in very nicely. I've mixed 80 milliliters of our Flynn Sisters Artist Cure resin for our final coat. And we're going to spread this on with a gloved finger, making sure everything's coated nice and evenly. But we also don't want to group too much of that epoxy along that tape line. We want to keep everything nice and clean. Clean up any kind of drips from the bottom so we don't have any pooling of excess epoxy along the tape line. Once I've got everything spread out nice and smoothly, I'm going to hit it with my torch to pop any bubbles, and then I'll set a timer on my phone to come back and remove that front tape line in about 30 minutes or so. When we come back to remove the tape, make sure you just wipe away any kind of excess from the tape line before you start to pull it. Also, you want to make sure you don't wait too long so that the epoxy starts to cure before you start to pull it, so that you have a bunch of strings and screw up that nice crispy edge. Also, at this time, you want to go through again with a popsicle stick and just scrape away any excess epoxy along the bottom tape line. And from here, we'll want to set another reminder on our phone to come back in about 3 to 4 hours to pull the bottom tape line. Remember, we need to remove the tape before the epoxy is fully dry. So at the 3 to 4 hour mark, when we go to remove this tape from the back, just hold it upside down very carefully, being sure not to rest it up against anything or knock into something, and very carefully remove that tape. Once the epoxy is fully dry, we can restore the shine with some butcher block oil. I got this a while ago from Lowe's, I think, and all you're gonna do is just dip your shop rag into it and rub it into your board. And make sure you just really rub it in evenly to every wood surface, making sure to get the sides and everything. And this is going to fully restore the shine. It's food safe. This is made for butcher blocks. And if you have any charcuterie boards or cutting boards around your house too that need the shine restored, you can use this for that too. But this will make the board look brand new like when we started. So any kind of scuff marks from sanding or any of the dull points, this is going to bring everything back to life. You want to let this sit in for a few hours before you gift it or use it. I would say probably let it sit in for a good 24 hours before people use it with food. And I would probably do a quick rinse in the sink first. But anyway, this is fully hand washable, so you can use it to serve food. You can hand wash it. It is not dishwasher safe, obviously, but I absolutely love how this turned out, and I cannot wait to use this around the holidays to serve charcuterie at my next party. Thank you so much for watching my video, and we'll see you next time. And a big thank you to all of our Flynn Sisters exclusive members. Thank you for your pledge. Your support means the world to our channel. If you love this video, you could check out our last video here. Also be sure to find us on Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, and of course subscribe for all our new videos that come out every Wednesday and Saturday. Thanks so much for watching. See you soon.